Hello everyone, today we talk about the 4th century AD in a Roman perspective. I don't know why I embark in such challenging enterprises, such as trying to summarize these topics in such way, but I noticed that people like a bit this kind of brainstorming and browsing of the bigger picture, not just sort of the very in-depth ones. I also know that late antiquity and the migration era are evergreens, and that therefore there is always so much even just to dig into that. This will, I think, create multiple videos at a time, because again, I planned these to be single, stand-alone videos, but it turns out that I have to fracture the episode into multiple uploads, if anything, for the overall length, and of course the chance that we can take here to discuss quite interesting things. Because as you know, it's always a matter of historiography at the end of the day, how to interpret a big topic, all right? You know that on Schwerpunkt, I haven't really launched a crusade against the notion of mechanistic determinism when it comes to sort of historical method and interpretation. The more I've gone on in my historical path, having started from the most formal and obviously continuing in my sort of side, the professional side that you don't see here, but that things essentially proceed from authority rather than from this kind of, again, specific referencing. I say this perhaps because I'm very much informed by a more technical type of research, namely reconstructing battles, and so how does that make sense? Like there is just one way to make things work, and honestly, this is really finding the actual answer. What has really prompted me into history, even when I was a child, and I didn't know essentially I would become a historian. I wasn't even really imagining what that could be about, but while unaware, I displayed this trait, right? I was never satisfied with other people's explanations, so that when I approach these topics, and especially again the bigger ones, I can be quite critical in as much as I believe that, just not methodologically, but even though I truly believe that history is method, right? It's not history to me, it's not the past, it's not scholarship, it's actually the very method per se, just like science to me is, right? So whenever I see some kind of overall judgment or take that fundamentally doesn't even try to be accurate or objective, at least as a fundamental purpose of that, meaning that scholars are, of course, legitimized fact to have a biased opinion, because we all have it in some ways. But when that falls short of any sort of effort of objectivizing the topic morally and scientifically, and so mostly trying to present a narrative that tries to sometimes, especially to desecrate or to simplify, etc., I'm not really very interested. Which, now thinking about this, this is actually the best way to make history, I presume, because the result must be objective and accurate. Unfortunately, however, the feeling, the center is also that, in the sense, history can always be like an eternal cycle, rewritten, and should be rewritten. It does happen, and it's unavoidable, really, because we are faulty in our judgment. New things come by, and or simply, in fact, biases change. And especially the latter point, in fact, I think is quite noticeable, right? And ever more, since like I make very sort of strong statements, historically wise, even in subtler ways than they may seem, I encounter really this friction by people who essentially claim that I would be a sort of ideologue, And aside from the fact that I don't consider the term ideology in an etymological sense, of course, a biased term, like ideas must stick together. There's a logic. You can't criticize the logic, but in this sense, it's still ideology. I still don't consider myself particularly ideological, right? I think that my work particularly resents from that. I mean, this started really from, I don't know why I'm starting a video like this by digressing right off the bat on such topics, but it started, with Reddit back in the day. It began, and Reddit, as you know, is a very sort of apparently liberally loaded and anti-authority kind of biased community at large, and it seems like the only purpose of Redditors at some point, there are, of course, clever people there, but and they tend to, in fact, waste that capacity most of the times. There's this obsession of tagging, of saying this guy sticks to this ideology or what is his ideology. Fortunately, as I often see from Reddit debates about revolving around my persona, there is always a healthy degree of skepticism, of acknowledgement of complexity, so that it's not really easy to say I do what at least sort of the bad thing, right? And trying to bend history to my own whim or whatever. And I would like really to point out from this and through videos like these, how easy it is to fall prey of ideologism when you don't rest on a sound knowledge of your own, right? And so much so that whenever you encounter somebody that has a point to the wall, it may happen that, if you're not aware of what the person is saying or why, you're not in that person's head, of course, but more or less you don't know their work, that is sort of biased or ideological, because fundamentally it bridges some gaps that are the ones of your knowledge, right? So that you feel essentially challenged or threatened by what this person is saying. This is something I have increasingly noticed also on YouTube, that any kind of criticism I ever receive is like slamming in 2 words whatever, and I say, but without actually explaining what's wrong with that or providing with any evidence whatsoever. And in fact, that's something I'm not habituated to, because I don't know, I'm habituated to be peer-reviewed. I have long letters explaining why, according to some people, they have to write at some point there is something wrong, not to sound too lenient, right? And trying to understand where they come from. That it seems like completely ridiculous, right? If you disagree with someone, if you want to really smear someone on the basis of opinions or the way he conducts himself, you should do that on the basis of actual evidence. And it turns out that sort of almost never happens, literally. And this was actually my initial, I can't say fear, but concern, at least to a degree, at the beginning of Schwerpunkt, several years ago. Meaning, I go public, at least through my voice, there's going to be so many people who's going to complain, criticize me, to dissect everything, and say that this literally not happen. And the incredibly rare times that this ever happened, there were just some incredibly biased and ostensibly rigged, sort of as pretty much simple ideologies that didn't really land anywhere. Like literally, like I make 2.5 hours video to make a specific and unequivocal macroscopic statement, and that person criticized me because he literally thinks that I'm saying the opposite of that. We're at this level, and that of course derives from the overall lack of general understanding in a way or another. Like if you're not even able to listen to what I'm saying and actually understanding what the bottom line is, it's like going to a professor and saying, okay, well, I criticize you because of this idea that I heard 2 minutes ago, and I don't even know what's your bibliography, right? I never studied anything of your work. This obviously has increasingly happened in Schwerpunkt, especially ever since I took some steps in the direction of this more comprehensive descriptions that really require a bit of narrative and not, I think, simply a stunned approach of the kind, I don't know, let's simply break down everything that was happening without trying to reconnect it once we have understood that. So the 4th century it's such a crucial time for really an important set of reasons. So just in historiographical perspective, we'll talk in part about this. The 4th century, first of all, and I think today we will be sticking mostly to religion, witnessed, of course, Christianity stepping up in several significant ways. Christianity was struggling to mature for a long time, and of course, the legalization of its cult, and especially the cooptation of the church and the imperial government, while still maintaining quite separated stance and privileges, and this understanding that it really was something aside from the saeculum, or at least from lay power, was really defining in Western history. It's by far the biggest religious change of this kind. There were other things happening in the world through Buddhism, through Zoroastrianism. We'll talk about that at some point too. But the meaning that the Christianization of the Roman Empire had is bigger for a number of reasons. First of all, we're talking a unitary empire that, by the way, was actually reinforced by the rise of Christianity and not the other way around. And an empire that was the most stably successful as far as its capacity to eventually influence the rest of the world through Western civilization, but even in the time, having really extended the sense of transfigurative redemption to Europe, the Mediterranean, and making this enormous display in all the surrounding regions is not something you can separate from the same Christianization. And or at least it was a prerequisite for the Christianization of the empire. And as we'll understand now, the continuation of a Catholic legacy, inasmuch as this could have never otherwise obtained like an imperial universal result. I actually made lots of videos explaining how Christianity was already aligned with the empire since the very beginning. A statement that many people find sort of strange, at least they have people about how, there were massive persecution. Well, first of all, there were not sort of actually massive, even just from a Christian standpoint. What happened in different provinces was a matter mostly handled at a local level, and we're not talking about massive baths of blood. Let's say if you look at confessional wars in the Renaissance, right there you had probably people really trying to butcher one another in a pretty consistent sense, and there were some policies of so-called tolerance that would also foster further the modern understanding of the same. But the Christianization of the empire, if you look at it throughout the centuries, was actually smoother and actually much more comprehensively integrated in the fabric of the very Roman society and culture. That gets often misunderstood, underrated. And again, I made pretty specifically theological videos about early Christian, also apologists, which we would expect in that sense being paranoidly, threatened by the terrible Roman Empire wanted to wipe out Christianity. That was actually not the case. It's also very well known how Christianity was carefully handled by the same emperors, in as much as it wasn't really a sabotaging cult towards the same fundamentals of the empire itself. Naturally, you cannot go as far as saying that by not recognizing the divinity of the emperor, or at least not sacrificing to him, that would, of course, entail major issue for the empire itself. But the way, in fact, the empire handled it was less violent than we actually think. It was rather Christianity to be relatively uncompromising, in as much as they truly believed that the church belonged only to God, and therefore it was not even an earthly reality. And we know from, of course, the New Testament in particular, how specifically argumented this idea was. Today is not the video for that, because we talked just about the 4th century. When, however, you really can observe, in fact, how cooperatively consequential to this to Christian development the legalization of this cult really was, right? Christianity was big. It had, again, not put the empire into fire and ashes. It had spread largely in a peaceful way, and also the Roman government had the widest amount of its history granted, in a way or another, its existence, right? Naturally, lots changed from the beginning of the 4th century under Emperor Diocletian, when Christianity was considered, from the official Roman government that still naturally believed at that point the possibility of maintaining both military and priestly offices tied together in the sole person, in particular of the emperor, that as God's medium would dispose basically of any other power through essentially the highest, as Pontifex Maximus, by the way, priestly official in the empire. This whole idea had, however, been undermined by the shortcomings of the same empire during the crisis of the 3rd century in particular, but also the general awareness that definitely existed at the time that the empire was in fact more vulnerable than before. Naturally, with Diocletian, Constantine, a lot is changing, including, of course, the legalization of Christianity, but also as we were saying before, the positive effects of the latter spread at those, for example, welfare levels that were in many ways taken over by the bishops, that could, in this sense, also establish a properly properly secular ecclesiastical administration that, as you know, would remain to this day, and defining a pretty orderly path of civilizational development, even in the moments of sort of imperial and royal shortcoming in the following century. So the fundamental question was, if the emperor is truly divine, how, and truly perfect in this regard, how can the empire go through crisis? Why is this rule so contested? And so on. But of course, the belief that at least God was to bestow power on individuals who had succeeded in wielding it was still at the center of the ancient world's beliefs. All right, Christ's words are not meant to dissociate the Christian community, the church, from the secular rule, the earthly rule. On the contrary, as far as the members of the church are fallen, mortal, they should be very concerned of earthly rule, but not in this sense in rejecting its authority, but literally giving back to whatever is coming short of divine expectations its due. All right. So in other words, respecting actually the power, the earthly power, but always pointing to the absolute as the true standard that anyone should abide by, because after all, even a Christian emperor will be part of the church in that direction. I made multiple videos explaining how this process also came sort of full circle by the end of the 4th century. I made a video about Ambrose of Milan, and also what is the actually painful removal of the altar victory from the Roman Curia, which did not actually put an end to, for example, vainglory symbolism that continues in the Holy Ghost. It's reinforced also in the further centuries at some point, and that's mostly a political issue revolving around what kind of adherence, let's say, of spiritual quality existed in the senatorial order for not recognizing the fall of essentially those from those divine standards that the emperors had undergone, and therefore, the necessity of restoring a more integral spiritual coming back to, in fact, to the absolute divine standards as Christianity suggested, like saying, like we are simply acknowledging that humans in the moment can't make it by themselves. But as you know, this is very well starting from the beginning of Christianity, the tradition of the martyrs, sainthood, etc. There is still a way to that, in a way that manifests in power also, say, compenetrating, we could say, not surpassing or eluding the traditional imperial power wielding. And this is essentially the same idea that glues together the empire and the church throughout the entire Middle Ages, because to make the long story short, what you actually see there is just a split of roles of institutional power through a distribution within still what will become a Christian society as a whole that was not meant to work separately, right? People sort of, you know that I have a staunch sympathy for what was entailed by the Ghibelline theology, so to say, in the Middle Ages, but there are some people who interpret this falsely as some kind of, okay, so the church was basically sabotaging imperial rule. There is no such thing like the empire or anyone being able to sabotage a rightful ruler, all right? You will be taken over by that and you will contribute to the same rule. So the church was rather born as a memento towards anyone who would claim divinity without having attained it, and fundamentally showing that there was a greater power on earth that was abided by spiritually, that you could, in this sense, measure and truly appreciate in the priestly standard that was to be a guide, in fact, for everybody involved, right? And you know that, of course, in different times in the Middle Ages, the alignment between the two universal powers was not just conventionally there politically, but throughout the entire medieval millennium, there was never such a thing like, the church dissociate itself from the concept of empire, vice versa. All right. This foundation is particularly happening, again, with Emperor Theodosius and Ambrose of Milan, inasmuch as Christianity, by the end of the 4th century, had become the official religion of the Roman Empire. And so the once persecuted Christians were now in charge, including partaking in the same forms of Catholic regulation. Some people would say persecution or discrimination, but actually this thing had always happened. Romans burned people for witchcraft. There was all a list of licit cults and illicit cults, and in general, there was a very sort of scientific wisdom to how and why this would be the case, which continued within the church in general. I can't even say the Catholic Church, because regardless of the judgment, also the Protestants, for example, continued in doing so later on. But that was considered obvious, and that would be, in my opinion, extremely useful to recover today as far as things like free speech are concerned, because people basically take things like, I don't know, there is paid posts on Facebook, so they're censoring stuff. This is against free speech. They don't want, the evil government doesn't want to make you. Hey, if you're so smart and the truth is at your reach and everything is clear to you, etc. Why doesn't anything you can freely post everywhere and can be seen by everyone get sort of appreciated so much? Maybe it is actually a matter of success and functionality. Struggles do exist. Political propaganda always exists, and it's not as if everything that is propagandized is actually false, as a matter of fact. And so you should actually struggle for the opposite, propagandizing the truth, right? And freedom of speech is mostly intended in those kind of, but I want to cry my own silly thing by getting the attention I crave for other shady, narcissistic and utilitaristic purposes, right? It's not like, let's evaluate how, for example, like a a negative ideology, like for example, actual threats. It's like saying, people were put in jail because they said this. Well, yeah, because it turns out that if you say certain things, such as I want to kill this person, or go out there and kill this person, you should be free to say that, in the sense that it's also pretty difficult to have a policeman behind every corner preventing you from saying that. But it's also something that, especially through the reach of social media, can really cause pretty severe damage. And it's not like, by the way, every person who does that gets sued or arrested or whatever in the process. There are very specific contexts, and I think losing the plot regarding what is sort of conventionally obvious juridical logic is not really a good indicator of civic education or any cultural development to begin with. So the fact that Christians began to persecute others, that actually most of the cases were other Christians, as we will see now, and that's actually a very important aspect of the story, is a story we should tell a bit better, right? I explained many times the difference between pagan, or better, what people intend by pagan conventionally, and who the pagans were actually in the mind of a person living in the 4th century, right? The notion that paganism that there was such a thing like paganism and Christianity basically had nothing to do with that, was a positive in those terms, is true only in as much as the religions ruling the world at the time were all Catholic. That is universal, and they already heavily persecuted chthonic, telluric, fortestator, populistic, dualistic, heretical cults that stem exactly from the fractally sort of provincialistic and lower socialistic part of the world. The people who were defending the maintainment of the Statue of Victory in the Senate would have laughed off any sort of modern accusation of paganism, because we would have said, but you don't even know what the word means in our world. These people were truly universal. They were embracing the religion of an empire that had, as we've seen, ended up conflating its institutions with a standard of governmental divinity just per se, as opposed to actually paganism intended as the lesser people sabotaging the system that the Christians were not even part of in that sense, meaning many Christians would have been pagan also because, say, many people at the time maintained both Christian and pre-Christian beliefs. And again, mostly Christianity simply kept flowing into the big track of Catholic religion. And of course, especially when it became powerful enough to be a church, ipso facto, it could not be of that mold, and it was sharing that Catholic legacy of the Roman Empire in developing like an incredibly powerful institution. Nothing different from, the great powers, for example, the temples existing as literal, institutions, but also guilds, also communities with militias, etc., were in the previous times. So what actually Christianity does is also clearing lots of ambiguities regarding the superstitious, tendentially, again, especially among the masses, character of belief. As we know, over the centuries, the truly heroic belief and standard was not fading just because you couldn't have many people abiding to that, to try maintaining those standards. But in fact, because they had concurrently stopping to believe, it was to be even attainable. Christianity came as a sort of healer and saying, okay, well, let's fix this. Like, why is it the case? Let's acknowledge better what our limits are and why that is the case. Alongside the ecclesiastical growing official status came an increasing need to institutionalize, in fact, that is, to develop the systematic administration to define the fundamentals of Christian theology, so this could not be threatened by this, as we've seen, the generations that were already reflecting like the general trend of the world at the time. So it's not much like as people think Christianity was invented at Nicaea or whatever. No, actually Christianity is shockingly coherent from the literally first couple of generations that witness to the fact that basically the synoptic Gospels as such were already there, which is an incredible. Many people say, "Oh, well, but it's decades after the death of Christ." But do you realize, in a strictly textual, literary, philological, historical sense, what does it mean to have that continuity? In that short amount of time of a fully fledged religion, as it would also further consolidate on the same basis at this point, officialize at least on the same point. How early that is and how small of a time that actually is. I don't know any other religion that came back to us that we have the actual historical evidence for the earliest consolidation, and in this sense, this enormous universal spread throughout the empire, maintaining the same identical core theology throughout these centuries even. So it's something extraordinary in and of itself. If anything, what was the matter here was to fully standardize the ecclesiastical practice through, again, administration, having, a systematized liturgical and institutional framework, procedures to ensure the church's unity and thus longevity on earth. This was a problem of the same scale that the lay authority of the empire was facing. And remember that the Roman Church emerges exactly from this scale of cultural grandeur and capacity to really posit itself towards the globe, and successfully, in fact, reaching to this day on the same basis. I will not even digress, of course, on my usual, especially early medieval appreciation of the Catholic Church's accomplishment, which is nothing short of extraordinary as well. But you can always find that in the relative playlists. Of course, this was a very complicated, difficult enterprise, right? You can't say that the results were clumsy at all, because actually what these were, whenever there was a failure and a lack of control, were fully fledged, again, heretical communities that were not even, as we've seen, like a novelty of Christianity. I recently made a video in which I talked about Hippolytus's prophecy pretty early on of the collapse of the Eastern churches, and the description of these kind of communities, especially in the fringe of the empire, especially in the East, but also in the least civilized parts, especially, along the Danubian frontier, etc., that were minority in that regard. It's mostly a Levantine thing. As far as the aforementioned legacy of this province's spiritual history in the previous centuries, again, you can't simply, as most people tend to do, if anything, from the manuals themselves, to start studying is the history of the church, especially from the 4th century, and or even just from Christ, without contextualizing, in that sense, the Christian message in the broader, not just as we've seen Catholic tradition, but in this sense, all the various currents and obviously varied manifestations within the same universal spectrum. Right? This is, I realize, what people tend to have some difficulty with, also because they have been convinced that somehow any, again, mechanistic textual reference is to be used only for the purpose of a cheap, like, or sort of very often dichotomically leveled gotcha kind of demonstration about something so immense like the moral pneuma of the ancient world. And we will in part discuss this, but remember in this sense the following, that within the early church, of course, there had always been some different directions that were not random, but directly stemming from the moral fiber of the populations who were accepted in this church. All right. This highlights, by the way, much better how the church was not just made was founded, of course, with Christ, but was sort of administratively developing on the basis of a human accomplishment or shortcoming that, of course, as we just said, is peculiar to the world in its current condition, right? There were many things to do. The church's expanding size was almost alarming, in spite of the extraordinary success that especially the 4th century witnessed. Especially the more advanced parts of the empire were Christian. Thus, they were not just to be administered for the sake of the size of the demographic, let's say, but also because these people tied into, as we've seen, the lay hierarchies at a level that now the Christians themselves will reach. Again, how can you separate the ecclesiastical from the lay? There is also the importance of an official recognition from lay authorities, meaning that Christianity, disorganized Christianity will be taken less seriously by the constituted order on earth. As a consequence, you have to stick to very specific standards, and again, it's extraordinary how much the church, of course favored by the same empire, succeeded in issuing these fundamentals. The growing acknowledgement that the parousia, by the way, that is Christ's second coming, was not as imminent as the early church had believed, prompted the necessity of a long-term vision for the church's role in the world, which, as you understand, intertwines with basically any other theological, philosophical, but also political aspects of the world. The relation in particular with the empire was crucial. By the time Theodosius declared Christianity the official religion of Rome, its early, almost informal congregational organization, led by elders and deacons, along with its simple forms of worship consisting of readings, psalms, and a shared meal seen in biblical and post-biblical times, had evolved into a massive hierarchy of clerical ranks and carefully defined methods of formalized liturgical worship, which was also the same reason why Theodosius had fully recognized with the Edict of Thessalonica the Christianization of the empire. This has not even been the first polity in the world recognizing Christianity, but let's say the Roman Empire is obviously the hegemonic spiritual force in Western Eurasia and beyond, so that you can never fully say, again, on basically a map and some Victorian idea of polity, right, what it means, like the end, for example, of the empire. This obviously was the greatest success of Christianization, and the implications of this are even dangerous to try to address in a single video, and we will not. In fact, we'll keep them for many other videos analyzing every single aspect of the same. So that the Roman world, in and of itself, bequeathed to the European Middle Ages not only Christianity's sacred text, the Bible, but also an extensive body of systematic theology that had developed since the foundation of the church, also, and in argument, at least, with those who wanted to deny the validity of such belief and its faith. This is also very relevant because, as we explained before, Christians were not really random people. They were the same Romans, and the Christianization even of the elite had started actually pretty and very early on, right? And this is an often underestimated aspect of the wall as well. And we're not even talking the lower estates, right? As you know, in the same gospel, there is the the parable of the centurion, that is actually telling you there how much of the fundamentals of Rome were being, truly aware of the Catholic nature of this religion and not just ensnared by some kind of leniency towards universal standards at all. We're talking a centurion that really wanted to save the life of his slave, which in that sense really reveals to you how much manumission and the emancipation of the conquered was at the heart of the transfiguring and redeeming Catholic belief. The same Christianity at this point was revitalizing in the process of its spread. The Bible, of course, is an incredibly complex scriptural body. It's not even technically systematized, or at least it came down to us in a way that was systematized. But if you look at its structure, notoriously it's a collection of poems, stories, letters, and historical accounts. And notoriously even some of the most strictly orthodox believers, the most educated ones, really look at this text and say, why should I read certain parts of it? I really don't understand it. I never really stopped to presume I can't understand it, but many don't even know it. Telling you the truth, I will, if anything, make multiple videos in explaining how and why that is the case and what it is that we should really approach the Bible like in order to make it work, right? And to understand it, it's part also a much broader traditional set of scriptures that would come incredibly handy if we weren't. And this is especially true. I was making a video about Jordan Peterson the other week, as you know, of how narrowly we tend to, at least especially Anglo-American debaters, to stick just to the Bible as if it was the only thing you had to learn in order to understand the Bible, right? And I'm not talking about the Quran. I'm talking about the before and the beliefs that, for example, the same Romans had, of how and why Christianity would have this specific successful relation with Rome, and why in that time in history, and why on the basis of which presuppositions. Like, this is very important to stress. We will see it better in other videos. And so when Christians consider, of course, the Bible as the inspired word of God, they were making by that a very specific lay statement as well, because the belief that stems from that body of text is something that relaunches a further struggle for interpretation in front of a world that had not wanted to believe that at least something had cracked deep inside at that point. And it's not, in fact, those previous beliefs had failed, right? It's the humans who had failed those beliefs. Never consider Christianity again in opposition with the Catholic religion of the empire and others in their historical context before this time. Why is it important, of course, to challenge the world through this text? Because the divine creation relationship between the two is something that really requires a very attempted philosophical insight, right? And not just a philosophical one, but in fact a theological, historical one. And in this sense, it's not quite simply true that, of course, the scriptures per se are enough. Hence also the ecclesiastical tradition, further studies, the fathers of the church, and again, all the context that can be given to something that is not just there to randomly save you, but that you have to partake in order to be successful in your works. Christianity develops this exegetical body, if anything, largely through the efforts of Christian theologians in Alexandria, during the late 2nd and the early 3rd centuries. These were, however, not the only ones. Let's say that the tendency to be more theologically, performing had to do with the practices of the previous Hellenistic school centers that naturally overlapped with this also the metropolitic sees of the empire, that Alexander, of course, was quite importantly because of Saint Mark, like each and every one of them was marked by an apostolic death and burial. This was the case also for St. Peter and St. Paul in Rome, that, however, was not as much as a theological center just per se. It would become, also in more quite distinctively effective ways, thanks to the papacy, also from the early centuries. But still the debate was a largely Mediterranean one, right? That would mostly see at least in this first centuries, the Levantine metropolitic sees to be more performing. The 4th and 5th centuries were, however, marked by the Christological controversies exactly stemming from the East, and so highlighting those problems that in particular those provinces gave to the Christological debate. This was the period also when the Church established its accepted understanding of the nature of Christ, and of course much of those controversies were the direct consequence of such affirmation. In other words, there were some churches that did not agree with certain lines. It should be stressed, by the way, that of course the Great Church Council convened by Emperor Constantine in Nicaea in 1325, defining the Orthodox dogma, was exactly the expression of a fully imperial and Catholic direction. All right, there were already some things that Constantine was doing in Constantinople that were objectionable from a general sort of victorial point of view. And always remember, when you say Orthodox, you're not saying the Orthodox. I can't believe, honestly, like, even though I'm used to general, unawareness, let's put it in this way, that Orthodox is something that literally means in Greek, like, properly allied, all right? It's just like the barycentric. It's something that you can measure almost in a geometrically directional way. So that's what Orthodox means. It's also in the conventional language way to say something that is straight, all right? By the way, today's Orthodox Church is actually named Catholic, right? The official name of the church has always been Catholic. And so there wasn't such a thing like a separation, like a Greek Orthodox Church at this point. If not, within at least a bit of a spiritual temper would later, but already at this time could call Byzantine, as much as the Greek legacy of that had informed a particular view of power that was, of course, in Constantine very monarchic, whereas, in Italy the Senate was still there, and with also an incredibly much more noble aristocracy as opposed to the sort of fictitious administrative one created by Constantine in the East, exactly to dilute the power of the components as well. Nevertheless, it's also important that Constantinople does objectively stick to a more to a non-Eastern kind of standard, at least compared to those Eastern Levantine provinces that will give more trouble to the whole system. What do I mean by that? Well, that even if you want to sort of criticize as we said before, the trajectory that at this point the Byzantine East followed, in particular concerning the relation between the church and the emperor, and mostly the subordination of the former to the latter in quite, in part, relatively traditional ways, but ones that, as we explained, did not really match the standards of rulers themselves anymore, and if anything, corresponded to a weaker church in that subservient role. Still, Constantinople was significantly distant in ethos as part of at least broader Hellenic heartland from in fact, this other, for example, Syrian or Palestinian Egyptian churches that were also had, of course, very importantly, Orthodox figures in all this, and as we've seen, they had been the same ones who had started, right, to contribute with those properly Catholic foundations of biblical exegesis and doctrinal elucidation, right? However, there would be the same places that would generate some heresies, with which, by the way, Constantinople will get compromised, differently from the West, that regardless of, say, the beginnings in terms of, again, the West was less Christianized, and then the Germans, as Arians came and sort of, at least nominally, rendered the system more complex. Actually, the West, as a broader European power, fully Catholicized, and especially in the later centuries, did not indulge in any kind of heretical diversion and equilibrism as Constantinople will entertain and engage in with the Levantine provinces, if anything, just for the sake of maintaining the control on them, which evidently was also a bit of an issue. You see that this is happening more or less between East and West, regardless of differences, also in timeline. As I explained also in some of my recent videos, you can't really say, unless you sort of stop the movie at 476, that, and so the East lived happy ever after. Things went pretty much south, and very soon, in a broader civilizational sense, again, unless you're fixated with the idea of power equals states and circumscribed territory, that even as far as that would be disastrous, at least by the 7th century in the East, is not really the indicator of a civilizational say, quality per se, right? And it's not, by the way, that I don't, as you know, don't believe that states are important. Just we tended to believe that the Romano-Germanic world was somehow underdeveloped, or owing to some kind of Byzantine revival, its sort of legacy, whereas the Roman legacy, the Romanized one, and plus including the German one on top of that, can easily be understood as more successful, revitalized, and more orderly than the East. But if anything, we will talk surely more about these topics in other videos dedicated to them. Now, these disputes that affected especially the East range from scholarly debates to outright violence. All right, this was a pretty brutal period in which different sects of Christianity really fought against one another. More or less, the pattern was always the same. There was some essentially Catholic, doctrinally orthodox stance that was essentially backing the empire and the state, as always, as civilization, as a more orderly development, and then the fringe essentially exploiting some local populistic and crisis and sort of political shortcoming in local was essentially taken over through radical extremistic stances and trying to loot as much as possible, riding the wave, in fact, of social issues more than else. The circumcellions in Africa, for example, were quite a good example of that. There were other contexts. Well, there were at times more exquisitely doctrinal issues. Think about Pelagius. I don't know if you look at it even as far as Ireland, right? And that is even Christianized without the empire having sort of straightforwardly as directly controlled it across the centuries. So it's all very complex, but it does still follow a pattern of civilizational success that ultimately yields its fruits, because if civilization does not succeed, like, you can easily see how it crumbles. And that's why, in spite of the general crisis, of course, of the world at the time, of entire Eurasia, look at the Guptas, at the Hans, etc., they were having essentially all the same problems, and say also the fringe, the provinces, the steppes were not faring better at all. Actually, we're even more desperate than that. But exactly in this sense, when you realize how the system exhausts itself a bit, shrinks a little bit, but what stands still is what had been historically more successful, and also revealing, if anything, that the foundations of the same. And that's why, for example, something more obviously Byzantine emerges later on. Because there had been some differences between the East and the West. It had always been pretty straightforward, and we don't tend to consider, because we think we're obsessed with the unity of the empires, if again it was a 19th century nation state. It has nothing to do with that. They had always been there, and if you sort of are able to read through it, all Roman history becomes much easier to understand without even too much sort of issues with which socio-economical dynamic, how much was inflation, this kind of thing. As if, by the way, this data did not reflect some sort of broader political, cultural issue, just as you can easily see today, right? Where do you think that the crisis stems? Like, it's not like there is some random accident that all of a sudden produces a crisis. It's people who do that, right? And there isn't much of a way around that in interpretation. So regardless of any kind of, the climate change, where you can always remember that humans can mess up things very much on their own, far better than any other random occurrence, right? And that actually highlights the importance of responsibility in the works, and actually the success of Catholicism stems exactly from that, from the actual acknowledgement of this responsibility, and the understanding of cause effect and how to providentially act down the line. The precisely formulated Nicene view on God, the triune, that is, a single God existing in three persons, and a person of God the Son, Jesus Christ, possessing two complete and simultaneous natures, one fully divine and the other fully human, requiring a deep understanding of Hellenic and not only metaphysics to be fully grasped. And admittedly, this is difficult to explain, especially if you're not familiar properly with the aforementioned entanglement of Catholic belief and what was truly as universally believed even by those countercultural paganistic elements, as far as the triumph or not, in fact, more Apollonian rule in the world. The matter is really simpler than it seems, and at the same time, it's terminologically slippery, at least in the way people have come to conventionally, at least, picture, not necessarily defining the Trinity, which is actually one of the most crucial foundations. For example, Islam does not have this, but if you look at Indo-European, there are reasons for that, because the Trinity is actually foundational to the properly interpreted vision of the world, of mankind to begin with, right? But to make the long story short, essentially the triune attribute simply stems from the fact that the Son, as the divinely transfiguring hero, is all one with his successfully transfigured soul, that is at the same time matching essentially with God's glory, thus coming back to that heavenly dimension with the Father, and or sort of simply achieving fully the entire three persons in one, right? So people have issues with this because they still reason in terms, but these three things are separated. How does it happen? Like, again, if you, like, it happens, like people, I see also in my channel, people did not believe that heroes divinized this. In fact, some heresies stemmed from that. But if you read the Bible, the entire concept is fairly well founded and read, and it's also that as a problem. Like, just think about how Christ was next to God at the moment of creation. That stems from, as you know, some beliefs, in that case, within the broader Jewish understanding of the universe that were, however, pretty firmly aligned with the context, or with the concept of essentially the coexistence of the predetermined with the determined, which is yet another thing that people normally don't understand. Like, it's either free will or everything is predetermined. This, Catholically speaking, it's a statement that per se does not make sense, because according to doctrine, both things are true at the same time, right? That thing is preordered as much as he who achieves divinity wanted that. Otherwise, that pure will would have not made it into divinity as well. And so it's impossible for that to have not been preordered by the divine as in its inherent existence. Here we should talk also about the doctrine of the two natures, but mostly, being totalizing, universally wise, including the action of the Son, that, however, truly achieves the divine status from a pre-existent and lower status. Also, Christ, for example, learns, if you read the Gospels, it's not like he's all he is, right? We know whom, but it's not like he came out as fully fledged God, right? He has to attain to achieve that, because otherwise the same meaning would have not been true. And so that's how you can attain all three, the actual persons. And again, we'll talk more about the Trinity in other videos. This was a concept, by the way, existing. Think about the Trismegistus. This is stuff dating back to sort of very old times, telling the truth, even before the Hellenic definition. And this, if you understand this logic, you understand also why specific heresies denied that, right? For example, disagreements arose from both sides of this aisle. Those who denied Christ's human nature, such as the Monophysites, and those who denied the fullness of his divine nature, the Arians and the Nestorians. The Arians literally said that basically he did not partake the nature of the Father, so he was basically just a human guy. And this is very interesting, because it shows how peoples around the fringe had already lost the notion that you could make it into heaven, right? So, for example, the Germans that embraced the former tended to they were not overwhelmingly theologically sophisticated in that they never really engaged any significant doctrinal debate by themselves. But there was a general sense of, especially of distrust towards the elites within them, that made it quite carefully controlled, like in terms of who can think to be God, literally. Whereas the Nestorians essentially overly stressed the separations of the divine and the human nature within the same person of the Son. And it's, again, Constantinople tried in any way to side, as you know, different times with, at some point there were Arian emperors, by the way, but in general also later many heretical leanings can be found in the Imperial, and much lower ones. In many ways, we'll talk about why such heresies were at some point even fashionable or countercultural. Arianism probably would have not prevailed, but it could make a more standing mark, especially in the East, paradoxically, because that was, as we've seen, more hierarchically concentrated, ecclesiologically wise. But you understand what's the problem. Essentially, these people tend either to think of Christ as God, just per se, and so some sort of so Christ, this was a big problem, because if you deny Christ's human nature, you deny a lot of other things, including not much incarnation per se, but the fact that he would have specifically not made it as a human back to divinity, because remember that in the ancient world, everybody was thought to be actually descending from God, right? Even though, again, if you read Genesis things are told more like a story that you must understand being mostly adapted and crafted to also the purposes of people. So we're not necessarily looking at the more peculiar specifics of ancient metaphysics just per se. And that is, in fact, the most difficult aspect that people have the problem with. So realizing that not everything is written out loud to tell you exactly how this metaphysical work actually occurred. Others, right off the bat, denied basically that Christ had a divine nature, and so that basically there could be something to, of course, his partial deification, but as some kind of hero that achieved just some lower level compared to the Father. All right. Now this is very problematic and by itself just indicating how much of the older metaphysical understanding had been lost by this time among groups that, as we've seen here, were quite dangerous and powerful and violent, and then created enormous problems to the church altogether. But the Catholic Christian coherence here is astonishing, because Christianity per se basically eliminates those obstacles to the full understanding that as humanity had fallen, it could also go the way back, and of course having a transfigurational effect, a redeeming effect on humanity. Now, by which degree is also very interesting, because that's a very underrated aspect, I think, at least in today's political discourse among conservatives, religious people, how, there's a big talk about the transfiguration of humanity through Christ's self-sacrifice. However, as people, in fact, are not familiar in general with what ancient metaphysics was actually about, the problem is that if you transfigure someone, you should have had this someone achieve something more, right? You can agree that, of course, through our very flattered modern secular views, we cannot grasp how transfiguration would have worked. There are people who maybe are aware of this and go as far as saying that the ancient world sucked, where everybody was basically already hopeless in terms of salvation. That's not how they had seen that, right? And one of the reasons why Catholicism succeeded through Christianity was exactly the latter's understanding of the fact that there had been some, of course, non-full, but still remarkable accomplishments carried by different actors, so to say, in the history of mankind. And that Christ, however, here was, by his sheer example, coming to surpass them all, and yet at the same time, in fact, not taking away the merit of mankind after transfiguration. And so many people say, well, Christ transfigured humanity eternally, so that we're still mortal, but we can't see how it is really in the end, because of also the last judgment, the general sort of accounting for the sins of humanity throughout its path and so on, as much as the ultimate struggle, right, in the end time, which is yet another sort of often not discussed aspect, which ties well in with the general ideas of other religions that we came to know from later times, such as, for example, the Norse one, that while not presenting because the great debate is about deification, right? Because some people, again, ones who always need the explicit text stated, like you can't deal with ancient sources, especially with religion, in the absence, especially of veritable doctrinal and, in this sense, formalized scriptural assessments, like you can find in naturally a very civilized world like the one of Nicaea 325, by the general context and by the general Christian awareness of the importance actually of dealing with these issues. Well, in those, like in the Norse, think about the Valhalla. What does it mean, actually? There are some Norse texts that go as far as saying that everybody falling in battle goes to Valhalla. Is it that the case? Well, no. We know pretty well that this was not the original idea. It's not like you step on a mine and blow up and all of a sudden, per se, you go to heaven. Also, heaven has an actual level of imperial stages, so to say, that are closer to God, depending on the achievement. I'd explained this in the videos about the doctrine of the afterlife as well. But even in a religion like the Norse one, say Germano-Norse one, I made also a video about that specifically, that had remained somehow fringe to the system, had not engaged into the broader Hellenic so Dorian, and from the other side, Roman, Italic, Apollonian understanding of the apotheosis of deification. Well, there you have it. There are some people, not everyone, who just basically through sacred warfare get into heaven, and that have to remain there until the end time, a great struggle. So this is not really a hell, for example. In the Norse legends, but you could switch from this to Hellenic mythology, etc. There are different fates. What about the Hades? What about the netherworld? Right? There are obviously different strata that overlap, and you have to sort out not just what kind of difference there was, which ones of the souls, for example, reached into heaven or actually didn't make it, and which ones would actually go to hell, even when the one of the person, at least, or not even the person, probably the individual, made it to heaven as well, because after that, of course, there was still especially from the side of the transfigured, a benign intervention, a bit like what you see with the relics in the Middle Ages, for example, in this world. And this was particularly the case of the deified hero, right, that you can find at different levels in different cultures. But to make a long story short, even these cultures that had lost almost completely in Beowulf, there is something regarding the idea that the hero can actually escape fate sometimes, right? Rarely, but still. And that's a pretty late reality. There is already Christianity around. It's really late compared to how and when this religions had sort of been, that this worldview had been founded. But we do know that there is this other dimension that we don't see, where there is truly an afterlife, and there is truly not simply death per se, because at some point that would happen for those souls that do not make it. You could think that in the end time, given that divine's power is infinite, everything can be truly resurrected, and that's the point, in fact, of the Judgment's Day as well. But the mere fact that there is a space for this after death, and that there is an imperial dimension and a hellish dimension, reveals to you how, and that is unavoidably connected with the individual's achievement and with the divinity as well, that can retribute that level from the higher nature, as hell also belongs to the lower, deteriorating one, and it's a completely different lower kind. It tells you how much of that divine reality actually was meant to exist and to reaccomplish Catholic unity through the splendid dynamic of the Trinity, right? It's as if, again, the Holy Ghost was a double thread between the higher nature and lower nature. The higher nature is God, and the lower nature is the one of the Son who sort of bridges the gap, just like literally the Pontifex Maximus that was understood as probably the sacred royalty eternally rising as the King of the living. You can understand the meaning of the Trinity if you understand that these three dimensions are becoming one in the soul at that point, truly God and divinely transfigured Son, and through the power of grace of the Holy Ghost. So it's actually much simpler, And if you're not aware of how the system works since the beginning, it's a bit difficult. If you, already by this point, most people did not have much of the notion that, again, a normal human could save himself. There was already some sort of secular modern issue with that. The same Christianity today technically says that you cannot save yourself but through Christ. And in this sense, works do matter, but there is a bigger picture because Christ has also transfigured. He has already vouched for you, so to say. But again, in what does that consist if not in you actually attaining or trying to attain divine standards? Otherwise, what do you do? Nothing, right? That's also why, in fact, Protestantism in a sense spread. But Protestantism was incredibly similar to these early Christian heresies, especially Arianism. And I suspect there is something there about Northern Europe, that the Germanic world, that in part favored, for different reasons, that kind of approach. Before I sort of minimized it through the idea that was important at the time, that the various Germanic peoples at that point were a bit in the crucial passage of giving away power to the monarchs, or at least to the oligarchs. And these would eventually, the ones that by pursuing monarchy would want to be sort of something more and bigger. And so creating this paranoia among the people. We've seen it also in the video about the Battle of Strasbourg, how the Alemanni infantrymen and freemen, in that sense, taunted the nobiliar cavalry, from imposed them basically to dismount for avoiding, like, leaving them, alone against the Romans and getting more power at home, seizing all their property after the massacre. So it's a big deal, and it's incredibly fascinating to realize that rather than some impersonal fronts, like such beliefs were baked into properly the entire worldview of the era. So I think it's extremely important to picture. The Arians were defeated in Nicaea, by the way, and not quite immediately, because Arianism became a dominant influence at the court of especially Emperor Constantius II, 337-361. This was very relevant because he had, for example, Alan bodyguards at some point, would have remained even pre-Christian, but there were lots of Germans as well that were fiercely Arian, and at that point, it was just like, being an edgy ruler today, having some kind of belief that makes you realize it's really excessive and really extreme, but doing it to counter certain other movements or takes or worldview, right? So there is a very wide spiritual spectrum within which, as you understand, everybody would fall, in a reason or another. In fact, what is interesting is also the general awareness. If we were to see, for example, the degree of Christianization among peoples that we conventionally don't understand having been yet Christianized and or having just observed these debates from an outside perspective, we would probably be quite impressed to realize how much of these beliefs and debates thrived, or at least were properly known in affecting the peoples of the frontier, in the Barbaricum, for example. It was kind of obvious, especially if you were to be, for example, serving in the Imperial military, as many barbarians did, by literally serving in the empire and then at some point just coming back in the Barbaricum to die in their later life. So it's as proud Roman veterans, by the way, as much as belonging to their originary tribes, etc. So it's really fascinating, and it shows, if anything, the completion, like not really the opposition, but the integration, the overlapping of these worlds, right? And it's true that in later times, especially the Christianization of the West would sort of slow down, as far as, in fact, the regions that had been part of the Roman Empire that had an ecclesiastical administration that kept functioning, for example, against also those people who believed, no, cities died at some point. How did they die? Considering that all over, like the dioceses were the same place where bishops ruled from, and were people living in even the rest of the city, or at least cities that had shrank in size but were still basically there. But that's because also the system had exhausted itself. So when you look at the high medieval conversion of early and high medieval conversion of Central, Northern Europe and beyond, you realize that all in all, this was simply continuing the obvious. It was a trend of Christian expansion. Naturally, a geography presents this to us in the sort of very difficult ways that this was done, like also with important coming backs in some cases, but actually we were pretty marginal, and again in contexts that were difficult. I don't know, it's like when the Vikings raised Hamburg to the ground. Well, it did not really stop the mechanism from really happening, right? Again, right? So that's the degree of coming backs that could happen. There is not really a pre-Christian coming back in a broader conversion of Europe, right? And that tells you not just how osmotically dynamic the mechanism was, but let's say how much of a straightforward continuation of the overwhelming weight of the say of just the specific weight of Romanity, and at some point also the Romano-Germanic system was meant to overwhelm in a civilizational sense all the rest outside. All right. During the 4th century, the Goths, as we were hinting at, and other East Germanic tribes in particular adopted Christianity in its Arian form. What is fascinating, by the way, is that these peoples were not actually dwelling in the most prosper, or at least closer parts to Rome of the Barbaricum. At least what I mean is that there is an Eastern European dimension, is also the one of the steppes. And you can argue that, I don't know, places like along the Rhine and the Danube had been under much sort of greater osmotic symbiosis with Rome to a degree. They were a bit also less developed. What perhaps is underestimated is how much the Goths were embracing a more, were being revived through the Iranic influence of all for example, the Sarmatians that they came to rule over, of that original sort of Indo-European steppe theological understanding of knighthood, of the imperium, of that higher sense of nobility and accomplishment that was particularly in line with, in fact, the Hellenic and Roman Apollonian worldview, right? And was to be very well spent, right? Also because the Romans, embraced these people. So embrace may not be the best term, but as you know, after Adrianople, there was no other thing to do in a military sense, and fabricated also later on, think about Cassiodorus, Italy, and so on, under Theodoric the Great, a veritable ethnographic and ethnogenic sort of historiography, myth, right? We know that a great part of the Gothic myth of the origins is very much debatable under the historical grounds, right? It's a dynastic history, different from other peoples that in historical times came, for example, to write down their own actual history, such as the Longobards, which were much more of a people's mythology, and that instead, in fact, finds an incredibly larger congruence with what we historically know about these people. With gods, it's more complicated. It's also not truly that the entire also migration of the gods was sort of made up, etc. Surely, however, it was a bit more complex than what we've been told. Also, the geographical paths were more or less the same. There isn't necessarily much of a doubt that they descended from the Vistula, then the Dniester, and so on. However, the broader sense is also that the Romans facilitated the Gothic cooptation and also influenced them in their beliefs. When we realize, however, that the spread of Christianity, which is incontrovertible, at least in like when the Gothic kingdom of the Bosphorus, Germanicus, had been established, that those, for example, their burials were oriented towards the east. There was a general, and for example, angelic iconography was eventually spread, in particular in Justinian times, even among the Byzantines and the Longobards, through by the fact with the angel like from symbol from the Gepids. That is perfectly in line with the broader sense of angelic and etheric idea of power. The same Michaelic cult, as you know, is very much archangelic in that sense. And if you look at these Riders of the Steps, the kingdom of the rising sun that the gods established in the East, it was a deep esoterical and kind of metaphysical revival, true religious understanding with the further development of power. And this aspect is, again, probably very much underestimated, especially if we make a chronological comparison to what was considered like in, I don't know, Romulus tradition already back in the day, the deification. You realize, as far as we understand also through the Vedas, etc., that deification was really a very big deal for the Indo-Europeans, and that the fact that some of these people, most of them, like at the time, in Proto-Indo-European times, did not have a written culture, actually does not really affect in a considerable way. The fact that these peoples would eventually adopt Arianism by themselves is also interesting, because it shows that at least the broader oligarchy did not probably enjoy very much the notion that they would have had a single ruler, a deified one, over them. So paradoxically, they had recovered some of the most interesting insights in that kind of reactivation, right, of divine transcendency through feats of arms and sort of holy warfare. But they still, in fact, didn't reach the level of monarchic cohesion, even when proper kings were elevated by the Romans, in particular, starting with Alaric. Among what are, in fact, confederacies, right? It was exactly a reason why they were, in the sense, accepted by the Romans. At least the Romans allowed these people in the system, especially after the Christianization of the empire, even before the official date, but in a fashion that, as far as from the German perspective was concerned, was actually countercultural. It wasn't even just about, again, the internal order, but it was about the sense of feeling themselves separated from the Romans to a degree. That's why, for example, some of these really roots when separated. It's fascinating, because when you look at the Franks, for example, that's much later with Clovis, but just, I don't know, yet another 100 years, he would not just convert straightforward from pre-Christianity from Vodanism, essentially, into Christianity. But his, sanctification of blood would run in parallel with his quite strongly dynastic and monarchic power. So the idea was literally that these dynasts had some kind of divine origin, as it was really understood, again, also in the previous past, which could be understood, in fact, in less monstrous terms than, for example, the Kinotaur. That would be Merovec, that is literally a sea cow. Waters were understood as primigenial in many ways. It's just like in the tradition of Romulus and Remus, of Moses, etc. And also among the Germans, there was some holy anointing practice to, in fact, further sanctify what was considered a higher race of rulers. We'll get more into this because we notoriously know very few of what these guys were doing, how they were thinking, etc. But again, that idea again in Beowulf still that, you can sort of manage to dodge destiny because after all, you're the hero, you're supposed to do. So what that speaks of some above position of these individuals compared to humanity. And so if there is any ambiguity regarding this, it should be mostly dispelled by the general center of what is not human is basically divine, all right? And the deep, as we've explained before, interconnection through that had been always there in the European iconography of the sun, of so the sun as God, the charioteer, that is the warrior, the champion, guided by the Holy Ghost in front of him. That is just also essentially an avatar of himself. So again, it's difficult to unsee that, especially in the earliest representations of power. So whichever path you want to choose to judge this, as to see that it was maybe initially starting with the sun as a sort of more apotropaic thing as opposed to something. It was always apotropaic, but apotropaism was present, in fact, also in the European culture, in the Chthonic substratum. So even there, wouldn't it be straightforward to think that aside from any compenetration and necessity of properly an order between the two elements, the reliance on the sun and the heavenly dimension is most obviously tied with a concept of holy warfare, and therefore something that will automatically separate itself from the more telluric vision of the world to an extreme as well, to the extreme consequences of the same concept. I think it's very important. Think about Ra, and that is the same, Pharaoh, basically. Depending on the different vessels at which time. It's so straightforwardly there in all the civilizations advanced enough at some point in history for us to grasp that their meaning, that their mythology, their metaphysics, right? However, that's also why the Germans were relatively, influent in terms of heretical spreading, because yes, Arianism spread widely in Western Europe with barbarian migrations, but there wasn't much of an actual theological consequence on the local Catholicism because of that, right? It's not like, the Vandals were Arian, the Goths were Arian at some point, people in Africa, in Italy, in Spain were affected by Arianism. Actually, these were by far the most Catholic areas out there, differently from the East. And this is also the most interesting thing, because as we've seen in many videos, it's from there that the same Christianity had originated. At least Hellenism had favored its spread. Also the urban culture and the ecclesiastical administration. And a urban culture that, however, was immediately with St. Peter and St. Paul shifted towards the urbs par excellence, because this was not simply a Hellenistic world, but one dominated by Rome. And so, again, in the West, there isn't any major heretical spread, right? There are some provincial cases, again, the Donatists. In Africa, there are some, but it stops there, right? It's also reverted in a generation or so. And so, in the East, you have instead monophysitism that remained there essentially through the centuries and gaining significant followings within especially the Egyptian, the Ethiopian, the Armenian, and Syrian churches. And again, this is essentially what brings, apart from the Ethiopians, in part the Armenians, to fall in the hands of the Arabs later. And again, I made a specific video, search for Hippolytus and the decline of the Eastern churches. Speaking volumes also of what I was just mentioning, that is to say that the Indo-European metaphysical understanding of the world tied immediately a lot where? Considering the Catholic plenitude of the Christian message of the Trinity, as we explained, etc. In the East? No. In the West. In Rome, in Italy, in Gaul. Why, according to you? Well, because probably these places had maintained an actually more straightforwardly traditional understanding of the Indo-European initial models that, as we've seen, were at the root of the same spread of Rome historically across the empire. For which reasons, right? Again, I made multiple videos about, there is the one about the moral superiority of Roman civilization and Indo-European interpretation. There's the video about the Romano-Italic peoples and their ethnic background, their beliefs. We'll come back on this aspect because I find it extremely relevant. I also discussed partly this in the videos about Rome, Roma Eterna, the one about the Lictorian Acts, from the Lictorian Acts to the Christian cross as a broader Catholic legacy of the Roman Empire. These things are so macroscopic, by the way, that it can't be hidden. I mean, if you're not interested, admittedly, in this kind of topic, it's a bit difficult to make you like that, right? However, in general, it's so straightforwardly there when, especially you grow familiar with the general spiritual vibes of the different parts of the empire. Again, if you have not been much into the idea that the Roman Empire was but, I don't know, the Black Death to be shot down or something like that, of course you will have not noticed. But overall, right, we can notice that these concepts flowed pretty straightforwardly from a spring to another. In fact, it is extraordinary how the same Christianity emerged within the Jewish world. There was surely some Indo-European influence already in Levant from a very long time. The same Jewish thinking, by the way. The same Star of David at the end of the day seems to be also motivated by the early Indo-European incursions in the Middle East, etc. There's a lot of very interesting stuff about that. Think about the same struggle and therefore hybrid with the Philistines, etc., the Sea peoples, the Indo-European waves against the Levant, and so on. Without mentioning that, of course, that region had been under a very heavy Hellenistic and Persian influence. On top, you have the Roman one as well. So, what emerges with Christianity is objectively one of the single most shocking things in the history of mankind. I mean, the fact you see that Christianity itself expresses what we eventually can recompose through the previous metaphysical understanding of the world, and that is written down. People don't even understand it because they have in mind, I don't know, the Judeo-Christian tradition as, look, this is the Bible, the only thing that you have to read without any context, and starting to fundamentalistically, literalistically quote single passages to think it fits into your sort of narrow-minded idea of what a Catholic religion is unfortunately what dictates the standards in the world nowadays, right? Like, most people are completely oblivious about this all, and I think instead, if we don't recover it, we're done for, also as a civilization. in the very meaning of the time. Like, you can't another thing that often happens in this context is that people tend to make it just a purely, again, nominalistic, theologistic kind of matter, completely separated from history, right? History becoming, basically any other field, but religion becomes the one of the left that has secularized and modernized everything. Also, theology was of course shipwrecked in the process, but at least, of course, who reads the Bible, who carries out its exegesis and so on, is obviously interested. If anything, I know many sort of leftist liberals, even atheist people, who of course understand what the necessity of having a culture by studying the Bible differently from, I don't know, I will not make any names, but unfortunately we've been under very heavy atheistic and sort of attemptedly atheisticizing forces that have definitely not helped the system. Constantius proved to be an effective, albeit ruthless ruler, largely maintaining internal peace and securing the empire's borders. This reflecting his culturally shocking choice of, again, adopting Arianism in this picture, and giving also, in this sense, probably of a pat on the back on all those Irano-Germanic forces that he had come to acquire in his army, however, leading to his death and to a violent succession until the throne passed to his cousin, Julian, who ruled, as you know, for only a couple of years, but became one of the most, at least historically, famous figures of the era because of this attempt to sort of restore the pre-Christian, and you can't even say what Julian's actual religion, we know what it was, actually was the Hellenistic Byzantinizing version of the Catholic tradition. There is, as you know, an enormous debate regarding this guy, or could he restore the empire? There are plenty of YouTube channels that have spread like crazy in the last years that are all about basically late antiquity, as if the entire history stopped to that, and mostly to accusatorily structured on the pattern of, look, if the empire had not Christianized, look at these Christians, we're just a bunch of, we're just like today's LGBTQ plot, literally, like we're talking people followed by hundreds of thousands who literally think it's history. Like looking at the last most influential guy would say, if this guy had actually done this, etc. As if, by the way, this epoch changes could simply stop to, again, what this or that emperor actually did. There's a deeply flawed historical and philosophical, but quite concretely historical, as much as philosophical misunderstanding behind this views. Like it's as if, I don't know, say these, you understand the depth we've given to religion in these videos. Like imagine thinking that this was not the situation was not the product of a millenary process of the generations and issues, etc., that would bring about this changes, and thinking that all this depended on what this guy individually did, by the way, in 2 years of reign. Because I like Julian as a figure, but I think he was somehow, overrated on the basis of the fact that his reign was so short that we can't even say what he would have technically done, right? He proved to have a great potential, but at the end of the day, he also ended in a fashion that, as you know, was voiced. It was also killed by the Christians in perfect, likely the thing did not really happen that way. And it would be interesting, in fact, to get a bit more in Julian's philosophy rather than religion, because it's wrong, in fact, to presume that we're talking about different things. Of course, he deeply despised Christianity for all the reasons that historically had been pushed by before, like in opposition to this rule that was trying to chastise, especially the elite. an imperial establishment for failing to consider a sort of more, again, integrally spiritual dimension preceding any other earthly consideration. He hated, by the way, he had sort of genealogical issues whereby he considered himself the actual descendant from probably the non-bastard branch of the Constantinian family, which also was an issue considering how important nobility was for these rulers. Known as Julian the Apostate by the Christians in later centuries, he found Christian teachings crude and unappealing. His refined intellect was drawn instead to, again, these other forms were mostly in the philosophy of the year, as you know, returning to a more, especially what was being formed as a Neoplatonic philosophy in a highly mystical sense. So there was some good in it that actually reflected the original beliefs of tradition, and this mostly applied to his elite background. He was also a very cultured person, so he was aware of the higher theological standards, and he thought he could basically incarnate, but failing, for example, in death, and such a major campaign in the East that sort of make you think how grandiose this figure was, yes, but not in the sense that he could really make such a big change in actual fact in history, and that mostly drew attention because of his broader opposition to Christianity that, regardless of his admirable qualities that passed a bit also under in this sense, attracted attention on him, so that people who in turn hate Christianity magnify his opus as if there could be this new resurgence in a way that, by the way, the Christians hadn't themselves acquired, right? Because it's not like Christianity, as we explained it before, was really springing out of nothing or without particular influences or without resenting of this Neoplatonic ideas. I mean, just think about St. Augustine. How would this... We're not talking about all the dualistic heresies that also existed that, in fact, informed at some point, depending on how you can deviate a bit certain ideologies, certain philosophies, the liminal approach, for example, in the relation between spirit and matter. And again, St. Augustine is there, basically. Julian began replacing Christians with pre-Christians in high governmental and educational positions, a policy that, for the fortunes of the church, was cut short by his brief reign, but that, again, would have likely not yielded any long-term result, let alone sort of having the church crumbling or being, arresting the spread of Christianity. What mostly it's put on the fore by people who tend to make the argument that, again, this was feasible, is some weird economy of numbers, like saying, let's calculate exactly or try to calculate how many Christians there actually were and how many other non-Christians there actually were. As if, by the way, you could understand what people in the 4th century AD actually believed without districating yourself into this incredibly massive entanglement of obvious universal reflections between one another. I mean, this was not like some categorical difference where simply Christians could be singled out of the rest of society, or some people didn't believe what essentially saying Christians believe, but without necessarily buying to the Christian rituals, right? Or I don't know, that the contrary was true. There were lots of Christians that de facto remained practicing the same pre-Christian rites, and they found it perfectly coherent with their Catholicism in particular, without mentioning those who really came, as we've seen, from different social backgrounds that had different ideas, more Apollonian, more Dionysian, different sects within this or that say community, for example, but also some centers of power that, for example, revolved around single temples. So it's really complex to look at a world where also you couldn't eradicate pre-Christian religions, so to say, simply destroying any other belief or the possibility of erasing cults, simply any kind of of sanctuary or community revolving around that. This was simply not real, was not feasible, and it didn't really lead anywhere of what we normally consider. Naturally, medieval Christian authors would later regard Constantine as a great hero among emperors and Julian as a great villain, and this is not really entirely true. I mean, Constantine had really dark sides that at some point we will talk about. This is notorious, but they should and must be really contextualized as well, because, again, what are we looking at exactly at the time? What was happening in this courts, which were the relations of power? Of course, there were incredibly bad dynamics to a degree, showing you how many tensions of power, how much everything was instrumental to this or that aim. But the pursuit of power along the side of this broader theological issues was of incredible relevance. And we know how much the Byzantines, for example, maintained a so-called Sebastocratic view of rule, showing that the tendency towards a despotic idea of a deified emperor, without, however, much success along that line. I mean, one thing is a deified Augustus, and there you can seriously discuss how much of a divine status could be achieved. Other, random rulers that came to be attributed these characteristics in or titles, things that had also in part been lost. We've seen it in the videos about sort of Byzantinistics. Also, who were these rulers? Was there always this great deal of traditional continuity with titling, with practice? Not really. They changed that fairly a lot and fairly often throughout their history. That's the measure of what I was talking about in terms of standards collapse. And I think it can't really be denied or hidden right in front of, especially the following developments of the system. In other words, we insisted on that kind of lack of balance towards lay power, lay figures. Like, this is also with Islam that does not really have a clergy. Like, it's always an incredibly evident in its failure. Like, it's not deniable in many ways. Conversely, Latin Germanic Europe would maintain a greater interconnected cohesion, regardless of political division, which shows also how you shouldn't essentially consider the system that way. So understanding the Roman world like this, today we talk a lot about religion. I understand that because there is a second part, we'll talk more about the political and military side of the story, right? But it's really crucial to look at this from a religious point of view, because otherwise you can't properly picture why these other things were going on, why these beliefs were so crucial, right? And why they were coming to affect the world so heavily. I think this is really, really important to appreciate. So, again, these are the kind of videos that usually make lots of views, and or at least tend, surely the latter part about politics and warfare and the fall of the West, etc. Will make more. You may think it's all chaotic, but when we look at the completion in Schwerpunkts, playlists, etc. First of all, you say, I always manage to maintain a specificity about this, because none of these topics is really repeated in the same way. It's not really the... let's search here for the late antique playlist, but say it's always browsed from a different perspective. It's always properly intended from a different angle, and exploring other aspects in between that I've never heard discussed, telling the truth. So it's it is really complicated, and it would really benefit with some further comprehensive topic. And then we are entering into that same horizon. Here, late antiquity, we had made so many videos about the Roman Empire, most of the Germanic stuff, but we will come back with this soon, because we have a substantial amount of videos. Like tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, we'll talk about the political military side of the story. I had then a video incoming on Valentinian the First. Never really discussed him. So again, we will see lots of very interesting stuff. There's another video about Theology. This is going to come a bit later, but again, pretty much overlapping with this one. Another stuff about the some late Roman military gear. So there is going to be a pretty substantial amount of late Roman stuff. And I'm really glad, because it's one of those eras that you can, as I was saying at the beginning of the video, talk about forever and ever, because it's always it's so complex and complicated. And if anything, I hope to enter further depth and detail at the same time. I haven't created yet centuries dedicated playlists for before the Middle Ages. So I think that I shall start with the 5th, the 4th century, the 3rd century, because that I'm sure will draw a lot of attention. I know that you like the migration era, in particular late antiquity, so I try to make it sometimes also more than you would otherwise find, right, in other format, so to say, meaning that I would actually like to talk more about the Roman Republic. We don't do it very often. This is unfortunately how it's come to be. I am also preparing lots of images for the Manipular Legion, which I told you, like, I can't find adequate pictures for, because we still have to cover the entire chapter of the Punic Wars and the Roman conquest of the Mediterranean in general, right? We still haven't done practically anything of that, and that's terrible. So without that, you can't even understand here the progression, how much it changed. I know there are, over the centuries, I know many of you are particularly syntonized on the idea that, as I was saying before, anything military, I mean anything late antique is somehow more important than anything else. I don't know why this is so contentious. I don't want to believe that it's literally because of those people who think how the Roman Empire could have been saved by not having been Christianized. Yeah, because that's exactly how it happened. But unfortunately, that's also where we get at a point. My only hope is, of course, as always, that videos like this can be provocative, can be sort of interesting in a broader sense, not just... I know that recently I've really been heavy in terms of this world traditional stuff, but I can assure it's random. I'm actually trying to make much more military historical content rather than else, and it seems to me that if anything, these other topics are necessary for the basic history, because nobody would otherwise tell you the same in this fashion. Anyhow, we have come to this, and for now, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.